Great. Well, this week we have David Betteley, who is head of content for automotive for IAFN. So, welcome, David. Um, Great to have you here. You tell us firstly where you are in the world.
Okay, I live near Stratford-upon-Avon in England, so I live in the Warwickshire countryside in the Cotswolds, if anybody knows it. So I'm very fortunate to live in a very beautiful part of the world.
Very good. So, you've had a very interesting career, but I'd love to hear a little bit about your background and what you're up to these days.
Okay, so yeah, so I mean, people describe me as an automotive veteran, although I still think I'm about 14. Like most men, I'll never, hopefully never grow old. But I've had a 40-year career in automotive, not all in automotive financial services. I did run a car business also for 5 or 6 years based in Sweden, running Sweden, Denmark, Finland, the Baltic states and Russia. So I've operated in Russia. I learned to speak Swedish pretty fluently actually while I was there. I went to school every night for 2 years, and I still speak Swedish all the time now. I speak Swedish to my wife sometimes when we don't want anybody to understand us. So Sweden's become a bit of a second home really. We often go back there to holiday and so forth. But in my last couple of jobs, I retired for the second time just over 2 years ago from Jaguar Land Rover. I was global head of financial services for Jaguar Land Rover, and prior to that, I was a senior vice president for Toyota Financial Services, running a third of the world for them. And prior to that, I was managing director of Vauxhall Finance in the UK. So I suppose that's why people call me a financial services veteran. But nowadays, I work with the IFN as a content advisor, and that covers a multitude of sins. But I advise on content. I look after the customers, develop new customers. I develop a lot of new ideas and trends and themes for the IFN that we do research. We employ people to do research. I've got a couple of MBA students working for me at the moment doing some pieces of research. And we sell that research, we turn it into white papers and webinars and so on and so forth. But I'm also turning to be a little bit of an entrepreneur. I've got a couple of new start businesses that I've invested in and started. One is called Tomorrow's Journey, which is a B2B car sharing platform, and the other one is a company called Credit Car, which is a new hybrid type of financial services aggregator. But it's unique in many respects. So we've got high hopes for both those businesses.
Great. So a good overlap for Trōv and sort of our world. Although I will say our experience is not as deep as yours. We're only around for 7 years at this point. So tell us, you and I were talking about this beforehand about asset financing. So IAFN being International
Asset Finance Network. Yeah.
So for the sort of uninitiated of us out there, we may not understand kind of why asset financing has relevance in the world of mobility. Tell us maybe a little bit of the sort of the rationale for why it's important actually for enabling the industry.
Okay, well, I mean, asset finance is really important for both consumers and for commercial customers. And I suppose basically it enables you to get the usage of a product without actually paying for it in full. So you spread the cost over the useful working life, and there's a multitude of different products that deliver that. In the past, I think the products have all been about ownership. So you maybe paid a deposit and then paid the balance over a period, and then you owned it. Leasing has obviously become fairly popular over a long period, where it's a similar kind of payment pattern, but you don't actually own it. But what you're finding now is that the industry is moving towards different ideas, and they are pay by use and pay by outcome. So, and that's not an idea that's not new. And you think about a taxi, you pay by outcome. You pay for the taxi because you want to go from A to B. You don't buy a piece of the taxi. But when you're thinking about the car business, or mobile phones are a good example. I mean, nobody buys a mobile phone. I mean, you tend to enter into a contract, and the contract includes other services, which would typically be data, and it might be free text, it might be phone calls, old-fashioned phone calls, and so forth. So you buy a package and you pay a monthly fee, but you don't own the phone. And then when you've 2 years on, you're fed up with the phone, the battery doesn't work very well, and you just get a new one, and you maybe sell the old one on Gumtree or something if you end up at the end of the contract. So you're getting a lot of those new types of contracts where you pay by you pay by use, and that's both in the retail business, but it's also very prevalent in the commercial business as well. And one of the things that's really enabled this kind of new payment is the technology that's built into machines and cars. So, it's the Internet of Things. So, if you look back in, particularly with agricultural equipment, 20 years ago, they started to put telematics into machines, and initially that was really to deliver serviceability. So if there was a service problem on the machine, it would alert the central factory, and they would then send somebody down to fix it before it broke down. And that's how it all started. It was really to keep things running, but that's morphed into new ways of actually pricing. And so you'll see a lot more of that over the coming years. And it's enabled by two things. One, it's changing customers' attitudes by the way that we buy stuff like mobile phones, because we've all got a mobile phone and we're used to not owning it. So there's those changing attitudes. But secondly, it's really the change in the technology, particularly the technology that's built into the machines that enable these new pricing models.
It's interesting. You captured a couple of trends that are enabling our customers at Trōv and some of your investments as well, in the sense of, as you said, changing consumer behavior. I'd like to, rent access to transportation rather than own it. Internet of Things, so the data coming off the vehicles is really important, and we on the insurance side actually use that to right side insurance. The asset financing is really important because as I do a quick check across all of our customers, I don't believe any of our customers who are commercial operators bringing fleets to market for consumers to use, they actually lease all of their vehicles. So there's an asset financing going on underneath there. But there's a third trend that you're understanding particularly well, which is, and we're beginning to see a little bit, is electric vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
And those vehicles being brought to market in a way that either consumers can access them in an efficient way, or i.e. buy them for themselves or lease them or wherever it may be, or the fleets can make use of them and bring them out then as part of a mobility service. So tell us a little bit about the challenge in the asset finance world in terms of being able to make EVs accessible for folks.
Okay, so I feel like I'm a bit of an expert on EVs because I drive one. So and I know I understand the issues with charging and range anxiety very, very well because I'm a regular daily user of them. So, but the challenges for the asset finance industry are, firstly, the cars are very expensive. They're a lot more expensive than their petrol or diesel equivalent. And the irony with electric cars is because the starting price is a lot higher. The second thing is the residual value is, percentage-wise, is significantly lower and also much more difficult to calculate because there isn't years and years of data that you can rely on. So the gap between the going in price and the coming out price is significantly higher. Therefore, that makes the monthly rentals higher. The running costs are lower, but you've really got to, for the average electric car, you've probably got to be doing 15, maybe somewhere between 15 and 20,000 miles a year to even out the saving on the running costs to pay for the additional costs, the additional capital costs. And the irony with electric cars is that because of the range problems, actually doing 20,000 miles a year in an electric car is really difficult because a lot of that would be highway driving. And it's, I drive a Jaguar I-Pace. It's advertised to have a range of 260 miles. And if you drive it on the motorway, it's 150 miles because you're on power all the time, you've got no regeneration, and it's really not at all suitable for a long journey. So after you've done maybe 110, 120 miles, you're getting really worried because you've got to stop and recharge it. So, you can be driving for maybe an hour and a half at most, and then you're really looking around, where can I recharge it? And you've got lots of apps and so forth, but actually in my experience, they're really unreliable. The app says the charging point is available and it's working and available. You get there, either it's not working and or there's somebody on it. So it's very, very frustrating on the ground, even though the stuff you read on the internet about the availability of charging sounds great. Actually, when you use it, it's another story.
So that depreciation part is the interesting bit, if I understand correctly. So again, not an expert, and you're going to help us kind of decode this, but somebody needs to take on that depreciation risk, which is, I buy the car at whatever price point I buy it at. In 3 years' time, in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, we don't really know what it's going to be worth. And as I understand it, so if I'm a consumer and I'm purchasing that, that's kind of a big risk. I can't say, well, it's, you know, it's a Volkswagen Golf, and I know I get probably, you know, in 10 years time I'll get 20% of the value. So that poses some real challenges for getting the vehicles out there. And as you said, ideally what you'd like to do is use the car more to get the to balance out the cost, so to speak, because, you know, the running costs are lower. So what does that sort of mean from the industry's perspective? I'll sort of drop a seed here. You've explained to me that in the past, what the industry has tried to do is sell me as a consumer many cars over time, and it's kind of turning things on its head, as I understand it.
Yeah, so I can't say it's a trend at the moment, but there's a huge amount of discussion in the industry, and it's really the catalyst has been electric cars, and the sub-catalyst has been the difficulty in setting the residual value. And even when you set the residual value, it tends to be set at a level there's quite a big difference between the going in price and the residual value price, and that equates to a relatively high monthly payment. So what the industry is looking at is, if you look at the traditional way that the industry worked, the OEM, the manufacturer, would manufacture the car. It would sell the car to a dealer. The dealer would then sell the car to a retail customer. The finance company, typically the captive, would then finance the car for 3 years, and maybe after 2.5 to 3 years, the car would come back. The finance company would then sell that car to the dealer. The dealer would recondition it and then sell it as a used car, and the cycle continues. So the old model was to get a customer, keep that customer loyal, and sell them a new car every 3 years. So over a 10-year cycle, the sweet spot is to sell a customer about 3.5 cars over 10 years. That's the real sweet spot. Now with electric cars, because of the issues that we've talked about, it's very difficult to get retail customers in the first place because of the high costs. So typically a lot of them are going to corporate customers, particularly the premium end of the market. So what the industry has done is they've said, well, when that car comes back after 3 years, it's maybe been out on contract hire or a business lease for 3 years, we'll take that car back. Electric cars don't have the same wear and tear as a petrol or diesel car, because the biggest wear and tear item on a petrol and diesel car is vibration from the engine. Electric cars have no vibration. There's no braking because the motors do most of the braking. I mean, it's really, if you drive an electric car, you drive it with 1 foot. You can drive an electric car with 1 foot. You don't need, or with 1 pedal. You don't really need a brake pedal, because you can adjust the retardation. So they do last a lot longer. So at 3 years old, the company can take them back in, and obviously the cars then come down in value, so it's actually a much more affordable proposition. The residual value issue is less of a problem because the car's already 3 years old and it's taken quite a lot of depreciation. So then when it's 3 years old, the OEMs are thinking, well, actually, this is still a great car, so why don't we retain it instead of selling it to a dealer and being kicked in the pants for a low residual? Why don't we package it up and sell it then to maybe a relatively premium retail customer, because they're not bothered about how much the price is, they're just bothered about the monthly payment. And the monthly payment on a 3-year-old car can be significantly more attractive. So you then enter into an agreement with a retail customer for 3 years. The car comes back then when it's 5 or 6 years old. And then what you might do then is you might then say, well, actually, we'll still retain the car because it's still very roadworthy. We'll then put it into some kind of subscription fleet. So so what you would do is, instead of selling many cars to one customer, there's a lot of thought going into how can we retain the car on our balance sheet and sell one car to many customers. And therefore you get revenue out of the car over a 10-year period rather than only revenue out of the car when you sell it when it's new. And then obviously you've still got the issue when the car is 8, 9 or 10 years old, you've still got the issue of what to do with it then. And that's a more difficult question. I mean, most new cars, electric cars, are sold with a battery guarantee for 8 years. A lot of the analysis is that the batteries will actually last quite a lot longer. So cars are still, an 8-year-old electric car is still a really very serviceable proposition, and will probably continue to be for quite a lot longer. But it's a really difficult question as to what to do then. Do you recycle the batteries? Do you scrap the car? Do you replace the batteries? and there's still a lot of debate in the industry about, as the volume starts coming through, in a few years' time, you'll have a lot more volume coming through. There still really is not a complete solution to what you do with electric cars at 8, 9, and 10 years old. I think a lot of them will continue in life. They'll have a slightly lower range than they had before, but they still might be useful for people who are only using them in cities, or they may have to be scrapped. But an electric car is always going to be worth more for scrap than a petrol and diesel car. So, a 10-year-old petrol and diesel car, typically, if it's a small car, might be worth a few £100s, but a battery and electric car will never ever be worth less than a few £1,000s because of the raw materials in the car that can be recycled. So it has a different depreciation curve. It goes down more quickly, and then there's probably a longer flat bit, and it will always be worth more than an old petrol or diesel car at the end.
Well, there certainly seems to be something going on with EVs in 2020. So I'm in California, and our Governor Newsom, yesterday announced that in 2035, internal combustion engines will no longer be sold in California. So the time is right in terms of EVs. That it's another trend, a trend amongst many in 2020. So we're, for any people kind of listening back to us, September 2020. In the UK and in the US anyway, we're certainly still in COVID land. And so lots of reasons to look forward. And we like to end up these interviews with sort of that question. You're uniquely placed, David. You sort of at the intersection of a load of different things. What sort of trends are you seeing now, and what do you foresee as hopefully we get out of COVID here? What sort of trends are you seeing in the industry?
Okay, well, we chatted a little bit before the interview, so I've just conducted a webinar really on this subject in the UK, and I think the trends that you're seeing is that those trends that were relevant before COVID. I think the question is, have those trends accelerated or been decelerated by the crisis? And the second question is, has something new, a new trend been born during the crisis? So what will things look like when we move out of the crisis? And it's interesting. I mean, I spoke to a guy from a medium-sized bank in the UK, and he said, well, they started a digitalization program just really at the start of the COVID crisis, and they've actually continued with that. So they don't see any reason to change it. But a lot of companies have obviously had to get people to work from home, so they're seeing that as a relatively permanent trend. So they are building that into their thinking, how they can deliver the right kind of customer service for their customers, with a lot of people working remotely. So that's another trend that I think we'll see being built in. So it's a really great question, and a really difficult one to answer. But frankly, I think that the people that I talk to, they see that when they come out of the other side of the crisis, that they will want to continue try and pick up mostly with what they were doing before. And you think about, we talked about electric cars, we talked about diesel cars. I mean, the decision by governments before the crisis started was that they were going to phase out diesel and petrol. That hasn't changed. That will come back to the top of the list after COVID. And if we are in the automotive market, the biggest single issue that was keeping CEOs awake before the COVID crisis was the cost of electrification. That was the number one issue. And that will very quickly, hopefully once there's a vaccine and so on and so forth, that will very quickly go back to the top of the agenda, because making electric cars now it's very difficult to make any money out of them, because they get sold at significantly lower margins, and then it's typically the captive companies that pick up the residual value, which is another load of risk. So the other thing that we talked about today really was risks, about what were the risks before. You've obviously been through the pandemic with a lot of new risks. What will the new risks be going forward, and how do you work on those new risks? So one of the One of the new risks could be for the auto industry generally is, and it's something that obviously the mobile phone industry had probably 15 years ago and has moved on and dealt with that risk. One of the risks for the auto industry is if there is a big move towards paying for use rather than paying for ownership, that's a whole new set of risks for finance companies to deal with, because banks and finance companies are really good at assessing credit risk. I mean, they look at customers' income, outgoings. If it's a corporate, they look at their balance sheets and so on and so forth. And so they're really good, and they've got hundreds of thousands of people looking at credit risk, and they've got loads of software programs that do it. But if you say to somebody, well, actually, we want to pay for this machine, say it's a yellow good, a Caterpillar or something, or a JCB, we want to pay for this machine. We'll pay you so much for every hole it digs. And they're scratching their heads. They can't work that risk out. So that's one risk that is a trend that possibly has accelerated more during COVID. And that's the way customers want to pay. So you can't tell them, actually, you can't have that. You've got to go, but you've got to buy it. They won't have that, because somebody will solve that problem. So there's a whole new industry developing on how to treat these new risks and how to treat them and how to monetize them, how to make money out of these new risks.
Yeah. I think, you're on the money. I can speak a little bit for the insurance industry and the risk industry. We're being challenged in exactly the same way. In fact, that's sort of the door that was open for Trōv, which is align your costs and your benefit more directly to this business. And in our business, it's really about sort of units of economic measure, might be per trip or per rental or per PB, and that's very much where we're lined up with that. David, thanks very much for your time. I really appreciate it. Very insightful. Learned a lot, and thank you for your time.
Brilliant. Thank you. It's nice talking to you. Thank you. Bye-bye.